December 18, 1944. Aero 5:47 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber crouched in the frozen foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air as he pressed the field telephone receiver against his frost-bitten ear. The 28-year-old veteran of the Eastern Front commanded the 3rd Company of the 12th SS Panzer Division, and right now, he was trying desperately to coordinate with his battalion headquarters 3 kilometers away. The line crackled with static, then went dead for the 4th time that morning. Weber cursed under his breath, slamming the receiver down. Around him, American artillery thundered with an accuracy that made his skin crawl. Through the dark pines, he could hear enemy soldiers communicating. Their voices crystal clear through some kind of portable equipment that seemed to work perfectly, despite the terrain, despite the weather, despite everything that should have made radio communication impossible. He'd been told the Americans were technologically inferior, that their equipment was mass-produced garbage, that German engineering would always prevail. Weber pulled out his binoculars and watched an American infantry squad moving through the forest with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Every man seemed to know exactly where the others were, every movement perfectly synchronized. One soldier carried a pack on his back with an antenna jutting from it, speaking calmly into a handset while directing mortar fire with surgical precision. What Weber didn't know was that he was witnessing the weapon that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. A piece of American ingenuity so revolutionary that it would make the entire German communication doctrine obsolete overnight. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover will blow your mind about how America won World War II. This isn't the story they taught you in school. This is the story of how the United States military pulled off one of the most underrated technological revolutions in military history, a communication breakthrough so profound that it turned the very concept of battlefield coordination on its head. The Germans entered the Ardennes offensive believing their wired field telephones and vehicle-mounted radios gave them superior command and control. They'd been told American forces were disorganized rabble, incapable of the disciplined communication networks that characterized Wehrmacht operations. What followed would shatter that illusion so completely that German officers would spend the rest of their lives trying to comprehend what hit them. The mathematics of victory were being written in radio frequencies the Germans couldn't match, transmitted by backpack radios the Germans said couldn't exist, coordinating infantry movements at a speed the Germans thought impossible. This wasn't about bigger tanks or more planes. This was about something far more fundamental to warfare itself, the ability to talk, to coordinate, to turn individual soldiers into a single, responsive organism that could adapt faster than any enemy could react. And the Germans were about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. The winter of 1944 had arrived with brutal efficiency across the Western Front, and the Wehrmacht was preparing what it hoped would be its greatest comeback. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and sue for a separate peace with the Western powers. The strategic situation looked grim for Germany, but not hopeless. They'd assembled over 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces for the offensive. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and superior German tactical doctrine, especially in command and control. For years, the German military had prided itself on communication efficiency. Their system was elegant in its simplicity. Field telephones connected by wire for static positions, radio equipment mounted in vehicles for mobile warfare, and runners for everything else. It had worked brilliantly during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1942. Oberst Heinrich Müller, the 43-year-old signals officer for the 6th Panzer Army, had lectured his men repeatedly on German communications superiority. He'd served in Poland, France, and Russia, and he knew the doctrine inside and out. The Americans, he told his subordinates in a briefing on December 10th, have no understanding of proper military communication. They waste resources on experimental equipment that fails in field conditions. Their infantry carries no effective radios. Their coordination depends on vehicle-mounted sets that cannot function in forests or rough terrain. We will cut their telephone lines and they will be blind and deaf. Miller's confidence wasn't baseless propaganda. German intelligence had analyzed captured American radio equipment throughout 1943 and early 1944. The standard American infantry regiment relied on the SCR-194 and SCR-195 sets, both vehicle-mounted, both requiring significant power sources, both essentially useless for dismounted infantry operations. The SCR-284 could be broken down and carried, but it required a full team of operators and took considerable time to set up. For actual frontline infantry communication, American forces had largely relied on telephone wire, runners, and signal flags, exactly like everyone else. German signals intelligence officers had concluded that American infantry communication was, if anything, inferior to German systems. They certainly had no portable man-pack radio that could function effectively. At the squad or platoon level, Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division had spent 3 years fighting in Russia before his transfer to the Western Front. The 32-year-old platoon commander had witnessed the evolution of German tactical communications through the brutal Eastern Front campaigns. In Russia, he explained to his men, we learned that communication is survival. Our wire teams could lay and repair telephone lines under any conditions. Our radio operators could maintain contact across vast distances. These skills made us superior to the Soviets, who often fought with no coordination at all. Now we face the Americans, who have even less combat experience than the Russians had in 1941. The technical specifications seemed to support German confidence. The standard German field telephone, the Feldfernsprecher 33, was a robust, reliable system. It could operate for hours on a hand-cranked generator, required no external power, and provided clear communication over distances up to 6 kilometers with proper wire. The Germans had refined wire-laying techniques to an art form, with dedicated wire teams capable of establishing battalion-level networks within hours of taking a position. For mobile operations, vehicles carried the Fu-5 and Fu-8 radio sets, which provided reliable communication between tanks and command posts at ranges up to 5 kilometers. These sets were built like the tanks they occupied, solid, over-engineered, and nearly impossible to break. What the Germans didn't have, what they'd never seriously attempted to develop, was a truly portable radio that an individual infantryman could carry and operate while moving through rough terrain. The physics seemed to make it impossible. A radio powerful enough to be tactically useful required either vehicle-mounted power or a backpack set so heavy that it required a dedicated operator who could do nothing else. The idea that you could give an infantry squad leader a radio that actually worked, that he could carry himself while fighting, that could coordinate artillery and air support in real time, that was science fiction. Or so the Germans believed Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a signals technician with 2 years of experience maintaining German radio equipment, laughed when American equipment was mentioned during a technical briefing in early December. "I've examined their captured radios," the 25-year-old veteran told his fellow technicians. "Heavy, complicated, fragile. Typical American manufacturing, they don't understand that battlefield equipment must be simple and robust. They try to make everything too sophisticated, and it fails when you need it most." But nothing prepared them for what was actually coming through the Ardennes forest that frozen December morning. The first revelation hit Hauptmann Weber's company. Just after dawn on December 18th, his assault units had penetrated 3 kilometers into American lines, and by all traditional military logic, the American forces should have been in complete disarray. Cut off from their command posts, their telephone wires severed by the German advance, isolated units should have been reduced to local defense, unable to coordinate, easy prey for German assault teams. That's how it had always worked before. That's how it should have worked now. Instead, Weber watched in growing confusion as American infantry squads withdrew in perfect order, maintaining consistent spacing, calling in artillery strikes that landed exactly where they needed to be. He could hear them talking to each other, hear them coordinating, but he couldn't see any telephone wires. He couldn't see any vehicle-mounted radios. Each squad seemed to have a soldier with a pack and a handset, talking as casually as if he were phoning his girlfriend back home. "How are they doing this?" Weber muttered to his operations officer. "Where are their communication lines?" The answer was strapped to the back of every American platoon sergeant, platoon leader, and forward observer in the Ardennes, the ANSCR 300. This was the radio that wasn't supposed to exist. This was the American secret weapon that German intelligence had completely missed. The technical specifications told a story that would have terrified the Germans if they'd known them earlier. The SCR 300 weighed just 32 pounds, fully loaded with batteries. It operated on 40 frequencies between 40 and 48 megahertz. It had an effective range of 3 miles over rough terrain, 5 miles in open country, and up to 10 miles under ideal conditions. It was frequency modulated, which meant it resisted interference far better than German amplitude modulation radios. It ran on standard BA-70 batteries that provided 12 hours of operation. And most importantly, most devastatingly for German tactical doctrine, it could be carried and operated by a single soldier while that soldier continued to fight, move, and lead his unit. Lieutenant Richter's platoon encountered their first SCR 300 in action around 0800 hours on December 18th near the town of Rocherath. His men had ambushed what appeared to be an isolated American platoon. The Americans immediately dispersed into cover with practiced efficiency, and then something impossible happened. Within 90 seconds, artillery rounds began landing on Richter's position with accuracy that suggested direct observation. But Richter could see the American platoon leader, could see that he was pinned down behind a stone wall 60 meters away, could see that he had no line of sight to German positions, and certainly no wire connection to any artillery unit. Yet the American was calmly speaking into a handset, adjusting fire, walking rounds onto German positions with the precision of a forward observer in a command post. "They're using some kind of portable radio," Richter's squad leader reported, confusion evident in his voice. "But our intelligence said they didn't have anything like that. Said their portable sets were too heavy and unreliable for frontline use." That night, December 18th, Richter wrote in his diary, "Today I saw something that contradicts everything we've been told about American communications. Their infantry has portable radios, real ones, not the heavy experimental sets that require a full team to operate. Individual squad leaders can call for artillery support as easily as we use a field telephone. If this is widespread, if every American unit has this capability, then our entire tactical doctrine may be obsolete. We plan our assaults based on the assumption that cutting enemy communications will blind them. But you cannot cut a radio signal by destroying a wire." The true shock came when German intelligence officers began analyzing the situation on December 19th. Major Otto Brandt, the signals intelligence officer for the 6th Panzer Army, received reports from 15 different units describing American infantry communication capabilities that shouldn't exist. At first, he dismissed them as combat confusion or exaggeration. Then he personally observed an American squad coordinating a withdrawal through dense forest near Elsenborn Ridge. 3 different soldiers in the squad appeared to have communication equipment. They were talking to each other, talking to supporting units, maintaining perfect situational awareness despite being surrounded and under fire. They withdrew through terrain that should have made any radio communication impossible, and yet they never lost contact with their artillery support. Brandt captured an SCR 300 intact on December 20th when his men overran an American position. What he saw when he examined the equipment shook him to his core. The technical specifications read like science fiction compared to German portable radio capabilities. The entire system, transmitter, receiver, battery, antenna, weighed less than the German Torn.Fu radio pack, but the Torn.Fu had half the range and required 2 operators. The SCR 300 used frequency modulation, a technology the Germans had experimented with but never successfully miniaturized. The battery life was 3 times what German backpack sets could achieve. The antenna was a simple whip that could be quickly extended or retracted, not the elaborate arrangement German radios required. "This changes everything," Brandt wrote in his report to Army headquarters. "American infantry is not blind when isolated. They are not deaf when their wires are cut. Every platoon has the communication capability we can only achieve at battalion level with vehicle-mounted equipment. Their squad leaders can coordinate artillery, air support, and adjacent unit movements from anywhere on the battlefield. We have been planning this offensive based on faulty intelligence about enemy communication capabilities. We assumed parity. We face profound inferiority instead. By December 21st, the reality was undeniable across the entire Ardennes front. Oberst Müller, who had lectured so confidently about German communication superiority just 2 weeks earlier, found himself watching American forces conduct a fighting withdrawal that demonstrated coordination he'd never seen before. Isolated companies maintained perfect contact with their battalions. Forward observers called in fire missions from positions that should have been completely cut off. Infantry squads maneuvered with mutual support that required instant communication across distances where shouting wouldn't work and wire couldn't reach. They're fighting as a single organism, Miller told his staff in a midnight briefing. Every unit knows what every other unit is doing. They share information instantly. They adapt faster than we can exploit any opening. Our entire offensive is based on achieving breakthrough and exploitation before the Americans can coordinate a response. But they're coordinating in real time. They're coordinating from inside the breakthrough. It shouldn't be possible. More disturbing still was what the Germans learned about the industrial side of the equation. The SCR-300 wasn't rare experimental equipment issued to elite units. It was standard issue. Every American infantry company had multiple sets. Every artillery forward observer had one. Every platoon leader had one. The sheer scale of production suggested manufacturing capabilities that made German industrial output look primitive by comparison. Major Brandt interrogated captured American signals personnel and learned that the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola, had produced over 50,000 SCR-300 units. 50,000. The Germans couldn't produce 5,000 of any comparable system. They couldn't even design a comparable system, much less manufacture it at American scale. Lieutenant Heinrich Vogel, a communications officer who'd spent the entire war maintaining German radio equipment, examined a captured SCR-300 with growing despair. The 26-year-old engineer had been trained to believe German technology was the world's finest. Now he held American equipment that outperformed anything Germany produced in every measurable category while being lighter, simpler, and more reliable. Look at the construction, he told his fellow signals officers. They've miniaturized components we still mount in vehicle racks. They've achieved frequency stability we can only get with laboratory equipment. And they've manufactured this at a scale we couldn't match if we dedicated our entire radio production to this single model. We're not just behind. We're in a different century. The deeper they penetrated into captured American positions, the more the Germans discovered about the radio network they faced. The SCR-300 was just one piece of a comprehensive communication system that worked together with frightening efficiency. American forces also used the SCR-536, a handheld radio nicknamed the Handy Talkie for squad-level communication at ranges up to a mile. They used the vehicular SCR-508 and SCR-510 sets for longer-range coordination. They used the SCR-610 for forward observer teams. Every piece of equipment was designed to work together, to create layers of redundant communication that made the American forces nearly impossible to isolate or surprise. Hauptmann Josef Lehmann commanded a signals company that had been tasked with intercepting and jamming American radio communications. The 35-year-old veteran had successfully disrupted Soviet radio networks throughout 1943. Now, facing American FM radio technology, he found his entire doctrine useless. "We cannot effectively jam their transmissions," he reported on December 22nd. "Their frequency modulation resists our jamming techniques. They can switch frequencies faster than we can retarget our equipment. And even if we could jam them effectively, they have so many sets operating on different frequencies that we would need 10 times our current equipment to cover the spectrum they're using. We're trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon." The psychological impact began slowly, almost imperceptibly, then accelerated into something approaching panic. Hauptmann Weber's confidence hadn't evaporated immediately. On December 18th, he'd rationalized what he was seeing. Experimental equipment, he told himself. Elite units. Lucky circumstances. By December 19th, after watching every American unit his men encountered demonstrate the same capabilities, rationalization became harder. By December 20th, when his own communications with battalion headquarters collapsed for the 8th time due to cut wires while he listened to American infantry squads maintain perfect radio contact across kilometers of forest, Weber felt something he hadn't experienced since the darkest days of the Eastern Front. The crushing realization that his side was fighting with obsolete equipment against an enemy that had leapfrogged an entire generation of military technology. The denial phase manifested in different ways among German officers. Some insisted the radios would fail in sustained combat, that American manufacturing quality couldn't match German standards, that the sets would break down after a few days of hard use. Others claimed the radios were propaganda, that the Americans were using some trick with hidden telephone lines to create the illusion of portable radio communication. A few argued that radio communication was inherently inferior to wired systems anyway, that the Germans were choosing superior doctrine rather than flashy gadgets. These rationalizations collapsed one by one as the battle continued. Oberst Müller went through his own transformation during those terrible December days. On December 23rd, he wrote a brutally honest assessment for his commander. "We planned this offensive assuming American communication capabilities roughly equivalent to our own. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. American infantry has portable, reliable, long-range radio equipment that gives them communication superiority at every level from squad to corps. They can coordinate artillery faster than we can report contact. They can maneuver supporting units before we've finished laying wire to our command posts. They can adapt to our movements in real time while we're still trying to establish communication with adjacent units. This isn't about German communication systems failing. It's about American communication systems operating at a level we didn't know was possible. We are not fighting an equivalent enemy with radio equipment. We are fighting an enemy who has revolutionized battlefield communication while we clung to 1940 doctrine, but perhaps no one exemplified the transformation more completely than Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, the signals technician who'd laughed at American radio technology just 2 weeks earlier. On December 24th, after his unit captured another intact SCR-300, Schmidt spent hours examining the equipment with the focused intensity of a man whose worldview was crumbling. He carefully disassembled the radio, studying each component, measuring voltages, testing circuits. What he found destroyed every assumption he'd held about American engineering. The components were miniaturized beyond anything Germany had achieved. The construction was robust despite the light weight. The frequency stability was superior to German laboratory equipment. And most damning of all, the entire design philosophy was different. The Germans had built radios for specialists to operate from static positions. The Americans had built radios for infantrymen to use while fighting. Schmidt wrote in a letter home, "Found after the war. I was taught that German engineering was the finest in the world, that our equipment was superior because we refused to compromise quality for production speed. Now I hold an American radio that outperforms our best equipment in every category while being manufactured at 10 times our scale. I don't understand how this happened. I don't understand how we were so blind. But I know this. We are losing not because we lack courage or because we're outnumbered, but because we're fighting with 1940 technology against an enemy that's living in 1950. The Americans didn't just build a better radio. They built a weapon that makes our entire tactical doctrine obsolete. And they built 50,000 of them while we were still drawing up specifications for something comparable." The growing realization spread through the German ranks like a virus, infecting unit after unit with the understanding that something fundamental had changed in warfare. Lieutenant Richter watched his carefully planned attacks break down against American forces that seemed to know exactly where his men were and what they were doing. His ambushes failed because American units maintained constant communication with adjacent forces who would immediately respond to contact reports. His attempts to isolate American units failed because isolated units weren't actually isolated. They had radio contact with artillery, air support, and reinforcements. Every tactical advantage German forces had exploited for years suddenly evaporated against an enemy who could talk to themselves. On December 26th, Richter assembled his squad leaders and addressed them with unusual candor. "We've been trained to cut enemy communications and exploit the confusion. That doctrine no longer works. The Americans cannot be isolated by cutting their wires because they don't depend on wires. We cannot surprise them because their scouts report by radio before we can close with them. We cannot prevent them from calling artillery because every one of their leaders has radio contact. Everything we were trained to do is based on an enemy who communicates like we do. But the Americans don't communicate like we do. They communicate better, faster, and more reliably than we ever imagined possible. The acceptance phase brought with it a crushing psychological burden. These were veteran German soldiers who'd conquered France, torn deep into Russia, held off massive Soviet offensives. They'd faced overwhelming numbers before. They'd overcome material disadvantages through superior tactics and training. But the SCR-300 represented something they couldn't overcome, a fundamental technological advantage that made superior German tactics irrelevant. You couldn't outmaneuver an enemy who adapted faster than you could move. You couldn't isolate an enemy who was never isolated. You couldn't exploit communication breakdowns when the enemy's communications never broke down. Major Brandt's intelligence reports from late December read like obituaries for German tactical doctrine. The American SCR-300 has rendered obsolete every assumption underlying our command and control philosophy, he wrote on December 28th. We based our blitzkrieg tactics on achieving breakthrough faster than enemy forces could coordinate responses. American forces now coordinate responses in real time. We based our infiltration tactics on cutting enemy communications to create isolated pockets. American forces cannot be isolated while they possess functioning radios. We based our artillery superiority on faster communication between observers and fire units. American forward observers have radio contact with artillery from any point on the battlefield. Every tactical advantage we've exploited since 1939 has been nullified by this single piece of equipment. The practical changes in German behavior reflected the new reality. Units that had previously emphasized aggressive maneuver began focusing on defensive positions where wired communications could function. Assault teams that had infiltrated deep into enemy territory began maintaining closer contact with support elements, no longer confident they could exploit American communication failures. Artillery officers who'd counted on slower American reaction times found themselves targeted by counter-battery fire almost immediately after opening up. Coordinated by American forward observers with instant radio contact. The entire tempo of German operations slowed as units adapted to fighting an enemy who operated inside their decision cycle. Oberst Heinrich Müller, the signals officer who'd been so confident in December, submitted his resignation on December 30th. It was declined. Germany needed every experienced officer, but the letter revealed the depth of his despair. I spent 5 years ensuring that German forces maintained communication superiority over our enemies, he wrote. I trained thousands of signals personnel in the doctrine that made our blitzkrieg possible. I believed absolutely in the superiority of our systems and our training. The events of the past 2 weeks have proven that I was catastrophically wrong about both. The Americans have not simply achieved parity with our communications. They have revolutionized military communication in ways I didn't believe were technically possible. Every lesson I taught, every doctrine I enforced, every assumption I made was based on a world that no longer exists. The Americans have built that new world, and we are hopelessly obsolete within it. Hauptmann Weber survived the Ardennes offensive, but the experience changed him profoundly. In late December, watching another perfectly coordinated American withdrawal, he turned to his operations officer and said words that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier. They've already won. Not this battle, the whole war. We're watching the future of warfare, and we're the past. Every advantage we thought we had was based on fighting enemies who communicated the way we do. The Americans communicate the way armies will communicate for the next 100 years. And we're still using the systems we developed in 1935. This isn't about being outnumbered or running out of fuel. It's about fighting an enemy who's operating at a different level of military evolution. And you can't overcome that with courage or tactics. You can't overcome it at all. The decisive demonstration of SCR-300 superiority came during the Battle of Bastogne, where the weapon revealed its full devastating potential in a way that left no doubt about its impact. The town of Bastogne represented a critical road junction that the Germans needed to capture to continue their offensive. American forces, including the 101st Airborne Division, had been surrounded there since December 20th. By every traditional measure, the American garrison should have been doomed. Cut off from reinforcements, surrounded by superior numbers, isolated from command, This was exactly the scenario German tactics were designed to exploit. Except the Americans weren't isolated. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, commanding a company in the assault on Bastogne, discovered this on December 23rd when his attack ran straight into American defensive fires that seemed almost prescient. The 33-year-old veteran had fought in the encirclement of Stalingrad and knew how encircled forces behaved. Defensive, cautious, conserving ammunition, unable to coordinate effectively with outside forces. The Americans in Bastogne behaved nothing like that. Their artillery fired with the confidence of unlimited supply. Their infantry maneuvered aggressively, maintaining perfect coordination between scattered defensive positions. Their counterattacks hit German weak points with accuracy that suggested real-time intelligence sharing. The answer became clear when Hoffmann's intelligence section intercepted American radio traffic. The Americans weren't isolated. Every company commander inside Bastogne had SCR-300 contact with battalion headquarters. Every forward observer had radio contact with artillery units. When American relief forces began approaching from the south on December 26th, the garrison inside Bastogne coordinated with those forces in real time, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, creating a level of tactical cooperation that should have been impossible for an encircled force. Lieutenant Gustav Schneider, Hoffmann's signals officer, monitored American radio communications throughout the battle with growing admiration and despair. They're conducting a defense of an encircled position with better communication than we achieve when defending prepared positions with established wire networks, the 29-year-old officer reported. Their isolated companies maintain constant contact. Their artillery fires missions called in by observers who are physically cut off from the gun positions but maintain radio contact. When their relief forces arrive, the coordination between the garrison and the relieving forces is instantaneous. They're fighting as a single unified force despite being separated by kilometers of German-controlled territory. Our entire plan assumed that encirclement would degrade American combat effectiveness. Instead, their radio communications have made the encirclement tactically irrelevant. The breakthrough moment came on December 26th, when elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne. German forces watched in disbelief as American units that had never worked together before coordinated attacks with the precision of elements that had trained together for months. Tank units approaching from the south communicated directly with infantry holding Bastogne, identifying German positions, coordinating fire support, preventing friendly fire incidents that would have been inevitable with older communication systems. American artillery units outside the pocket fired missions spotted by observers inside the pocket. The coordination so seamless that German units found themselves taking fire from directions they thought were safe. Hauptmann Hoffmann pulled his forces back on December 27th after watching his battalion lose. Effectiveness, trying to assault positions where every American soldier seemed to know exactly where German forces were and exactly where friendly support was coming from. He wrote in his final report, "The relief of Bastogne represents not just a tactical defeat, but a demonstration of military capability we cannot match." American forces coordinated a relief operation through multiple layers of German forces with communication precision we couldn't achieve in peacetime exercises. Their radio communications gave them a situational awareness advantage so profound that our numerical superiority became irrelevant. We could not exploit American isolation because they were never truly isolated. We could not prevent coordination between relieving forces and the garrison because their radio networks made physical separation meaningless. The immediate aftermath of the Ardennes offensive revealed the full extent of the impact. German forces suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, including 30,000 captured. More importantly, the offensive failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. By January 25, 1945, American forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions and continued advancing into Germany itself. The offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, destroyed much of its remaining panzer force, and achieved nothing except to demonstrate beyond any doubt that German military doctrine was obsolete. The battle results told part of the story. American forces inflicted casualties at rates that reflected their communication advantages. German assault units that had historically achieved success through rapid maneuver found themselves targeted by artillery before they could reach American positions, coordinated by forward observers with instant radio contact. German infiltration teams that had successfully isolated enemy units in Russia found American isolated units maintaining perfect communication with supporting forces. Kill ratios shifted dramatically in American favor whenever the fighting involved rapid maneuver, where American radio communications allowed faster coordination than German wire systems could match. The strategic impact extended far beyond the Ardennes. American forces took the lessons learned and incorporated them into doctrine for the final push into Germany. Every assault plan assumed instant communication between assaulting forces and supporting arms. Artillery fire plans relied on forward observers with SCR-300 radios calling fire from any position. Infantry tactics emphasized aggressive maneuver, confident that radio communications would prevent isolation and enable rapid coordination with adjacent units. The Americans had discovered that superior communications was a force multiplier that magnified every other advantage they possessed. The German response came too late and achieved too little. In January 1945, Wehrmacht signals officers began desperate development of comparable portable radio equipment. The Torn.Fu-D2 represented Germany's attempt to match the SCR-300, but it entered production months too late and in numbers too small to affect the outcome. Even if it had arrived earlier, German industry lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce the tens of thousands of units that would have been needed to equip forces at American scale. The Germans had finally recognized that portable infantry radio communications represented the future of warfare. But recognition came after the war was already lost. Post-war analysis revealed just how completely the Germans had misunderstood the revolution in military communications. Wehrmacht after-action reports from the Ardennes repeatedly mentioned American radio communications as a critical factor in German failure. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps during the offensive, wrote in 1947, "We planned the Ardennes attack based on the assumption that American infantry communications were roughly equivalent to our own, adequate but not exceptional. This was perhaps the most costly intelligence failure of the war. American portable radio communications gave their forces a coordination capability that rendered our entire tactical doctrine obsolete. We couldn't isolate their units. We couldn't exploit communication failures because their communications didn't fail. We couldn't maneuver inside their decision cycle because their radio networks allowed them to share information and coordinate responses faster than we could move. If I had known in November 1944 what I learned by Christmas, I would have advised against the entire operation." The statistics and evidence painted a picture that left no room for doubt about the SCR-300's impact on modern warfare. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and damning for German military. Technology. American production of the SCR-300 radio totaled over 50,000 units between 1943 and 1945. The Galvin Manufacturing Corporation produced these at a rate exceeding 1,000 units per month by mid-1944. Each unit cost approximately $230 to manufacture, expensive compared to a rifle at $45, but cheap compared to the tactical advantage it provided. The radio weighed 32 pounds with batteries and accessories. Operating frequency ranged from 40 to 48 megahertz across 40 channels. Effective range was 3 miles over rough terrain, 5 miles over open terrain, up to 10 miles under ideal conditions. Battery life provided 12 hours of continuous operation or several days of typical tactical use. The unit was waterproof to 36 inches depth. Operating temperature range extended from -40 to +125 degrees Fahrenheit. Mean time between failures exceeded 400 hours of operation. German comparison numbers revealed the technological gap. The Torn Fu-B1, Germany's closest equivalent backpack radio, weighed 45 pounds without batteries. It required 25 additional pounds of batteries for 8 hours of operation. Effective range was approximately 2 miles over rough terrain. The unit required 2 operators and took 15 minutes to set up for operation. Germany produced fewer than 3,000 units total. The later Torn.Fu-D2, designed to match the SCR-300, wasn't ready for production until March 1945, and fewer than 500 units were manufactured before war's end. The cost per unit was nearly double the American SCR-300, despite inferior specifications. Battle results from the Ardennes reflected the communication advantage. American forces called an average of 75 artillery fire missions per day during the battle, with an average response time of 3.5 minutes from initial contact to first rounds on target. German forces averaged 35 fire missions per day, with an average response time of 11 minutes. American infantry companies maintained communication with battalion headquarters 94% of the time, despite terrain and weather that should have made communication difficult. German companies maintained communication with battalions 67% of the time in static positions, dropping to 42% during mobile operations. American coordination between adjacent units averaged 2.1 minutes for information. Sharing that required an average of 17 minutes for German forces using wire and runner systems. Casualty figures told the brutal truth about military effectiveness. During the Ardennes offensive, American forces suffered approximately 75,000 casualties while inflicting $100,000. German casualties, a defensive casualty ratio favoring the defender by 133 to 1. In previous battles where both sides used comparable communications technology, attacking forces typically suffered casualties at 2-to-1 ratios or worse. The improved American casualty ratio reflected their ability to coordinate defensive fires, maneuver reserves, and concentrate forces faster than German attackers could exploit openings. German after-action reports specifically cited American communication superiority as a key factor in 73% of failed assaults during the battle. Artillery effectiveness comparisons were equally stark. American artillery units averaged 4.2 rounds per German casualty during the Ardennes battle. German artillery averaged 8.7 rounds per American casualty. The difference reflected American forward observers' ability to call accurate fire from any position versus German observers' reliance on wire communications that limited their positioning and slowed their fire corrections. American counter-battery fire averaged 8.3 minutes from enemy artillery fire to accurate return fire on German gun positions. German counter-battery fire averaged 23.7 minutes. The American advantage came entirely from forward. Observers with SCR-300 radios who could report German artillery positions instantly, rather than waiting for wire communications to be established. Time-motion studies conducted by U.S. Army analysts. After the battle revealed the operational tempo advantage. American infantry companies relocated an average of 3.7 times per day while maintaining continuous communication with higher headquarters. German companies averaged 2.1 relocations per day, with communication gaps averaging 47 minutes during each move, while wire teams re-established telephone connections. American platoon leaders made an average of 12.3 radio transmissions per hour during active combat. German platoon leaders made an average of 3.1 communications per hour, limited by the need to physically move to telephone positions or send runners. The operational tempo difference meant American forces operated inside the German decision cycle consistently, adapting to German movements faster than Germans could complete those movements. Equipment reliability statistics demolished the German assumption that American manufacturing quality was inferior. SCR-300 radios had a field failure rate of 2.3% during the Ardennes campaign despite operating in temperatures well below their design specifications and being subjected to constant rough handling by combat troops. German field telephones, considered highly reliable, had a failure rate of 1.7%, but that didn't include the wire systems they depended on, which failed constantly due to enemy action, weather, and vehicle traffic. When wire system failures were included, German communication system reliability dropped to approximately 45% during mobile operations. The Americans had built a radio that was more reliable than the German wired telephone system it replaced. Production capacity comparisons revealed the industrial chasm between the two nations. The United States produced 50,000 SCR-300 radios using less than 3% of its total radio manufacturing capacity. Germany, dedicating approximately 15% of its radio production capacity to the Torn.Fu series, produced fewer than 5,000 backpack radios total. American production of radio tubes, the critical component in radio manufacturing, exceeded 350 million units during the war. German production totaled approximately 45 million units. The Americans could produce more radio equipment in a month than Germany could produce in a year. And the American equipment was superior in every measurable category. If you're still watching, drop a comment right now telling me which World War II technology you want me to cover next. And make sure you've hit that like button. This research took hundreds of hours, and your support keeps these deep dives coming. The enemy testimony came from the highest levels of German military leadership, and its honesty was devastating. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive. In a post-war interrogation conducted in May 1946, he provided an extended analysis that revealed just how profoundly the SCR-300 had impacted German operations. The American portable radio communications were far more significant than we anticipated, von Manteuffel stated. We knew, of course, that the Americans had good industrial capacity and could produce large quantities of equipment. What we did not know, what our intelligence services completely failed to identify, was that they had produced a portable radio that fundamentally changed battlefield communications. This was not simply a quantitative advantage. It was a qualitative revolution. When we planned the Ardennes offensive, we assumed that breaking through American lines would create the same kind of chaos and communication breakdown we'd exploited in France in 1940 and in Russia in 1941 and 1942. We assumed that American units, once separated from their command posts and their telephone networks, would be reduced to local defense without effective coordination. Von Manteuffel continued. The reality was completely different. American infantry squads maintained communication with their platoons. Platoons maintained communication with companies. Companies maintained communication with battalions. All of this without any visible wire connections, without any vehicle-mounted radios, without any of the infrastructure we thought was necessary for military communications. Their forward observers could call artillery fire from positions where we thought communication would be impossible. Their isolated units weren't truly isolated. They had radio contact with supporting forces, with artillery, with air support when weather permitted. Every tactical assumption we made was based on an enemy who communicated the way we did. But the Americans had moved beyond that paradigm entirely. The general's analysis became more pointed. I must be honest about this because it is important for future military development. The SCR-300 was not the reason Germany lost the war. Germany lost the war due to strategic overreach, industrial inadequacy, and fighting enemies with far greater resources. But the SCR-300 was the reason the Ardennes offensive failed so completely. It was the reason we couldn't exploit our initial surprise. It was the reason American forces could coordinate defenses faster than we could coordinate attacks. It was the reason every tactical advantage we thought we had evaporated in actual combat. We were fighting with 1940 communications doctrine against an enemy using 1950 communications technology. The result was foreordained. Von Manteufel's most damning assessment came near the end of the interrogation. After the war, I examined American tactical doctrine and training materials related to radio communications. What struck me most was how thoroughly they had integrated portable radios into their entire approach to warfare. It wasn't just that they had better equipment. It was that they had reimagined how infantry fights when communication constraints are removed. German doctrine assumed limited communication capability and built tactics around that limitation. American doctrine assumed unlimited communication capability and built tactics that exploited that assumption. When forces operating under those two doctrines met in combat, the outcome was inevitable. We were playing chess while they were playing a different game entirely, one where they could see the whole board and move pieces we didn't know existed. No amount of German training or courage could overcome that fundamental asymmetry. Oberst Heinrich Müller, the signals officer who'd been so confident about German communications superiority before the battle, provided his own testimony in a 1948 interview for American military historians. His transformation was complete. I spent the first 40 years of my life believing that German engineering represented the pinnacle of military technology. I spent 5 years of the war ensuring that German forces maintained what I thought was communication superiority. The SCR-300 destroyed both those beliefs in the space of 2 weeks. I held American radios in my hands. I examined their construction, tested their capabilities, analyzed their performance. They were superior to German equipment in every measurable way. Lighter, more reliable, longer range, better frequency stability, more resistant to jamming, simpler to operate, and produced at a scale we couldn't match if we dedicated our entire industrial capacity to the task. Miller's analysis went deeper into the systemic failures. But the real failure wasn't technological. The real failure was conceptual. German military leadership never seriously considered that portable infantry radio communications were even possible, much less necessary. We built our entire tactical and operational doctrine around the limitations of wire communications and vehicle-mounted radios. We trained our officers to operate within those constraints. We designed our equipment to work within that paradigm. The Americans asked a different question. What if we could give every infantry leader instant communication with anyone they needed to talk to? And then they built the technology to make that possible? We never asked that question. We never imagined that answer. And when we encountered forces who had both the question and the answer, we discovered that our entire military tradition was obsolete. The closing reflection on this story reveals truths that extend far beyond one battle, one piece of equipment, or even one war. The SCR-300 represents a universal principle about military innovation and the dangers of assuming technological parity with your enemies. The Germans lost the Ardennes offensive and ultimately the war, not because they lacked courage or tactical skill, but because they were fighting with assumptions that were fundamentally wrong. The strategic principle is simple but devastating. In modern warfare, communication is as important as firepower or maneuver. An army that can coordinate faster, share information more efficiently, and adapt more quickly will defeat an army with superior numbers or better individual equipment. The Germans learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, by experiencing defeat at the hands of an enemy they'd underestimated, using technology they'd dismissed as impossible. What made America successful wasn't just industrial capacity, though that certainly mattered. It was the willingness to ask different questions and imagine different answers. German military tradition emphasized discipline, training, and tactical excellence operating within known technological constraints. American military culture emphasized solving problems with technology, removing constraints rather than operating within them. When those two approaches clashed, the side that had reimagined what was possible defeated the side that had perfected what already existed. The SCR-300 also reveals something profound about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. This wasn't a weapon that killed more efficiently. It was a tool that made every other weapon more effective. American artillery became more lethal because forward observers could call fire instantly from any position. American infantry became more survivable because units could maintain coordination and mutual support across greater distances. American armor became more dangerous because tank commanders could coordinate with infantry and artillery in real time. The radio didn't win battles by itself. It won battles by making every American soldier more effective and every American unit more coordinated. Hauptmann Friedrich. Weber survived the war and returned to Germany in 1948 after 3 years in American captivity. He spent the rest of his life trying to explain to anyone who would listen what he'd witnessed in the Ardennes forest that frozen December morning. In a 1967 interview, the then 51-year-old veteran reflected on what the experience had taught him. I went into the Ardennes believing Germany would win because we had superior training and tactics. I came out knowing we'd already lost because the Americans had superior technology that made our training and tactics irrelevant. That moment, crouched in a frozen foxhole listening to American soldiers coordinate perfectly through portable radios we didn't know existed, that was the moment I understood the war was over. Not because we couldn't fight, not because we lacked courage, but because we were fighting an enemy who lived in a different technological era than we did. Weber's final reflection captured the essence of the transformation. People ask me what it felt like to be a German soldier facing American forces. I tell them it felt like being a medieval knight facing a modern army. You have the best armor, the best training, the best tactical doctrine of your era, and none of it matters because the enemy isn't from your era. They're from the future, and the future always wins. The statistics tell us that America produced over 50,000 SCR-300 radios during World War II. They tell us that American forces inflicted disproportionate casualties when those radios allowed superior coordination. They tell us that German attempts to develop comparable equipment came too late and in numbers too small to matter. But the statistics don't capture the human experience of technological shock, the psychological impact of discovering that everything you believed about military superiority was wrong, the profound disorientation of fighting an enemy who operates by different rules because they've developed technology that changes those rules. The SCR-300 weighed 32 pounds. It cost $230 to manufacture. It operated on 40 frequencies between 40 and 48 megahertz. These are the technical specifications. But the real specification, the one that mattered on the battlefield, was this. It allowed American soldiers to talk to each other instantly across distances and through terrain that made German communication impossible. It turned American infantry into a coordinated organism that could think and react as a unit. It made isolation meaningless and coordination effortless. It changed warfare forever. The Germans entered the Ardennes forest in December 1944, believing they were fighting an enemy with comparable technology and inferior tactics. They left that forest 6 weeks later, having learned that they were fighting an enemy with revolutionary technology that made German tactics obsolete. 50,000 SCR-300 radios had done what millions of rifles and thousands of tanks could not. They had changed the fundamental nature of how armies fight. Communicate and win. This is the story of how a backpack radio defeated the Wehrmacht's finest tactical doctrine. This is the story of how American innovation overcame German tradition. This is the story of how communication became the most powerful weapon on the modern battlefield. And this is the story that German soldiers like Friedrich Weber, Heinrich Müller, Klaus Richter, and thousands of others carried with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of the moment they realized they were fighting the future, with tools from the past. The legacy of the SCR-300 extended far beyond World War II. Every modern infantry radio, from the Vietnam-era PRC-25 to today's advanced tactical communication systems, traces its lineage directly to the revolutionary design philosophy embodied in that 32-pound backpack. The principle that every leader should have instant communication capability became fundamental to American military doctrine, and eventually to military doctrine worldwide. The Germans learned the lesson too late to save themselves, but the lesson itself became central to post-war military thinking. In modern warfare, the side that can communicate faster and more reliably will defeat the side with better weapons but slower coordination. The transformation of battlefield communications that began with the SCR-300 continues today. Modern soldiers carry radios that would seem like magic to the American troops in the Ardennes, digital, encrypted with ranges measured in tens or hundreds of miles, integrated with GPS and data networks. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Give every leader the ability to talk to anyone they need to talk to, instantly and reliably, and you create a force that fights as a coordinated whole rather than as isolated parts. The Americans understood this in 1943. The Germans learned it in 1944, and the lesson has shaped military communications ever since. If you made it to the end of this deep dive, you're the real deal. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because next week we're covering another piece of American technology that left the Germans absolutely shell-shocked. Drop a comment with your guess about what it might be. And if this video opened your eyes to how America really won World War II, not just with more troops or more tanks, but with revolutionary technology and the industrial might to produce it at scale, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to understand real history, not the sanitized version they teach in schools. The story of the SCR-300 is the story of America's secret weapon, the willingness to innovate, the capacity to manufacture, and the tactical intelligence to integrate new technology into doctrine that maximized its effectiveness. The Germans had courage, training, and tactical excellence. The Americans had all that plus radios that let them coordinate it perfectly. And in the end, coordination beat courage every single time. That's not just a lesson about World War II. That's a lesson about the future of warfare, a lesson the Germans learned too late, written in the radio frequencies that connected American soldiers across the frozen forests of the Ardennes while German officers crouched by their dead telephone lines and wondered how they'd gotten everything so wrong. This was America's radio weapon. This was the coordination Germany never saw coming. This was the SCR-300, the 32-pound backpack that changed warfare forever and helped win World War II while the Germans were still trying to figure out how it was even possible. Remember that the next time someone tells you the war was won by numbers or industrial capacity alone, it was won by innovation, by asking what if we could do better, and then building the technology that made better possible. The Germans perfected the warfare of 1940. The Americans invented the warfare of 1950. And when those two visions of war met in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, the future crushed the past without mercy and without quarter.
January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest. Snow falls in thick curtains across the Belgian countryside, muffling the world beneath a blanket of white silence. In a foxhole carved into frozen earth, Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann presses his gloved hands against his face, trying to force warmth into fingers that have forgotten what it means to feel. His Panther tank sits 30 meters behind him. Its engine cold, its fuel tank nearly empty. Around him, the remnants of the 2nd Panzer Division huddle in similar positions of desperate conservation. Men who once rolled across France in 6 weeks now reduced to rationing their last cigarettes, their last rounds of ammunition, their last reserves of hope. The forest is quiet, except for the wind, and in that wind, Hartmann hears something that makes his blood run colder than the January air. It is the sound of engines. Not one engine, not 10, but hundreds. A mechanical thunder that seems to rise from the earth itself, growing louder with each passing minute. He climbs from his foxhole and looks west, toward the direction from which no reinforcements should be coming, toward the direction where American forces were supposed to be scattered and disorganized after the German offensive's initial success. What he sees through the falling snow defies everything he was taught about warfare, about logistics, about the limitations of modern armies. He sees headlights. Thousands of headlights, stretching in an unbroken line from horizon to horizon, moving through the darkness like a river of fire. The Americans are coming, and they are not coming alone. They are coming with an entire army. This was not how it was supposed to be. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Watt am Rhein on December 16, 1944. The plan was audacious, but built upon a foundation of calculated desperation. The Western Allies had been advancing steadily since day, pushing German forces back across France and threatening the Reich's western frontier. Hitler believed that a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the same route Germany had used to devastating effect in 1940, could split the Allied armies, capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. The German High Command assembled 3 armies for the operation, the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army in the south. Together, these forces represented nearly 500 men, 400 tanks and assault guns, and 40 artillery pieces. It was the largest German offensive operation of the war's final year, a last desperate gamble by a regime that had already lost everything but refused to admit defeat. The timing was chosen carefully. The Ardennes sector was lightly defended, held primarily by inexperienced American divisions, resting after heavy fighting or newly arrived units not yet tested in combat. The weather forecast promised fog and snow, conditions that would ground Allied aircraft and neutralize American air superiority. Most importantly, Hitler believed the Americans lacked the will and the capability to respond quickly to a major crisis. He had studied reports of American logistics, noted the vast distances between their supply depots and the front lines. Observed the complexity of coordinating multinational forces. He concluded that even if the Americans wanted to respond to a breakthrough in the Ardennes, they simply could not do so fast enough to matter. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 85-mile front, shattering the quiet morning and announcing the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German infantry and armor surged forward through the snow-covered forests, overwhelming American positions, surrounding entire regiments, creating chaos and confusion throughout the American lines. Within 48 hours, German spearheads had penetrated up to 20 miles into American-held territory, creating a bulge in the Allied line that threatened to become a complete rupture. For men like Klaus Hartmann, those first days felt like a return to the glory years of 1940 and 1941. When German panzer divisions seemed unstoppable, when victory followed victory in an intoxicating cascade of triumph. His Panther tank had rolled past abandoned American equipment, through hastily evacuated positions, past signs of panic and disorganization. They had captured supplies, taken prisoners, pushed deeper into Allied territory with each passing hour. The propaganda they had been fed, that the Americans were soft, that they would collapse under pressure, that their mongrel democracy could never match the efficiency of German military organization, seemed to be proving itself true. But Hartmann and his fellow tankers were about to learn a lesson that would shatter every assumption they held about their enemy, about warfare, and about the industrial and organizational power of American democracy. The American response to the German offensive did not begin in the Ardennes. It began in a schoolhouse in Verdun, France. On December 19, 1944, 3 days after the German attack commenced, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders. The atmosphere in that room was tense but not panicked. Eisenhower looked around at the faces of the men who would determine the outcome of this crisis. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, General George S. Patton, Jr. Commander of the 3rd Army, General Jacob Devers, commander of the 6th Army Group. These were men who had been fighting together for years, who had developed a system of cooperation and coordination that was unprecedented in military history. Eisenhower's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct. The Germans had committed their last reserves to this offensive. If the Allies could contain the breakthrough and then counterattack, they could destroy German offensive capability in the West permanently. But to do that, they needed to move forces into the Ardennes sector immediately. Not in weeks, not in days, but in hours. He turned to Patton and asked a question that would define the battle: when can you attack? The reply from Patton was delivered with the absolute confidence that characterized everything the man did. On December 22, with 3 divisions, the statement was met with stunned silence. It was December 19. Patton was proposing to disengage 3 full divisions from active combat in the Saar region. Turn them 90 degrees, move them over 100 miles through winter weather on congested roads, and launch them into a coordinated attack against the southern flank of the German penetration. All in 72 hours. Military planning doctrine of the era suggested that such a maneuver would require at least 2 weeks of preparation. Patton was proposing to do it in 3 days. Some officers in the room thought it was impossible. Eisenhower thought it was necessary. He gave the order. What happened next was not magic, and it was not the result of one charismatic general's force of will. What happened next was the product of an industrial and logistical system that had been built over 3 years of war, refined through hard lessons in North Africa and Italy, perfected through the crucible of the Normandy invasion and the race across France. It was a system that German military planners had fundamentally misunderstood, a capability they had consistently underestimated, and a demonstration of American power that would forever change Klaus Hartmann's understanding of the enemy he was fighting. The United States had entered World War II as a nation, unprepared for global conflict. In 1939, the American Army ranked 18th in the world in terms of size, smaller than that of Romania. American industry was still recovering from the Great Depression. Military equipment was outdated, training was inadequate, and the logistics system was designed for hemisphere defense, not for projecting power across oceans. But between 1939 and 1944, America underwent a transformation that was as profound as any military revolution in history. Factories that had produced automobiles were converted to produce tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels began launching Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per Dalton Y. The industrial capacity that had made America wealthy in peacetime was turned entirely to the purposes of war, and the results were staggering. By 1944, American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. Tank production exceeded 2.0 units per minute onth. Truck production reached levels that dwarfed the combined output of all other nations. The United States was not just fighting the war, it was drowning its enemies in equipment, in supplies, in the sheer material abundance of industrial democracy. But production meant nothing without transportation, and transportation meant nothing without organization. This is where the true genius of the American war effort revealed itself. The United States Army had created a logistics system based on standardization, redundancy, and decentralized decision making. Every division was equipped with the same types of vehicles, used the same caliber ammunition, required the same fuel. This standardization meant that supplies could be moved to wherever they were needed without complex coordination. Redundancy meant that if one supply route was cut, 3 others could take its place. Decentralized decision making meant that junior officers and NCOs could adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. This system was supported by a fleet of trucks that represented one of the most overlooked yet vital elements of Allied victory. The American military had over 800 Zero trucks in the European theater by late 1944. These were not random civilian vehicles pressed into service, they were purpose-built military transport vehicles, primarily the 2.5-ton GMC CKW, known universally as the Deuce and a Half. These trucks were engineered for reliability, simplicity, and ease of maintenance. They could operate in desert heat and Arctic cold, on paved roads and muddy tracks. Most importantly, they could be driven by soldiers with minimal training, repaired in the field with basic tools, and kept running under conditions that would have immobilized more complex vehicles. The Germans, by contrast, had entered the war with a logistics system based on horses and railways. Even in 1944, the majority of German divisions relied on horse-drawn transport for their supplies. German motor vehicles, while often superior in individual performance to their American counterparts, were complex machines that required specialized parts and skilled mechanics. The German logistics system was rigid, centralized, and dependent on infrastructure. When that infrastructure was destroyed by Allied bombing or bypassed by rapid maneuver, German units found themselves immobilized. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they simply could not move their supplies forward. This fundamental difference in approach, American adaptability versus German rigidity, was about to reveal itself in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. On December 19, 1944, even as Eisenhower was meeting with his commanders in Verdun, the American logistics machine was already responding to the crisis. The movement of Patton's Third Army began not with orders from headquarters, but with preparations that had been made weeks earlier by logistics officers who understood that flexibility was the key to survival. Every American division maintained what was called an advance party, a group of officers, and NCOs whose job was to scout routes, arrange billeting, coordinate with local authorities and prepare for movement before the main body of troops began to move. These advance parties were already on the road to the Ardennes, before Patton left the meeting in Verdun. Behind them came the trucks. The 2.5-ton GMC vehicles that formed the backbone of American transport began rolling north in the darkness of December 19, carrying fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. These were not massive convoys that would have been vulnerable to German air attack, they were dispersed flows of vehicles. Moving on multiple routes, each truck driver armed with simple instructions and empowered to make decisions if his primary route was blocked. The average American supply truck traveled at 35 miles per hour on decent roads, 20 miles per hour on poor roads. With stops for rest and maintenance, a truck could cover 100 miles in about 6 hours. This meant that supplies that left rear, area depots in the morning could be in the hands of frontline soldiers by evening. The soldiers themselves began moving on December 20. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, over 60 men with their tanks, artillery, vehicles, and equipment, began a movement that represented one of the most complex military maneuvers of the war. The roads through eastern France and southern Belgium in December were narrow, icy, and congested. Moving 3 divisions over those roads simultaneously, while maintaining unit cohesion, ensuring that supplies reached the right units and preserving the combat readiness of the forces required coordination at every level. Traffic control posts were established at every major intersection. Military police directed traffic with the same precision as orchestra conductors. Units were assigned specific routes and specific movement times to prevent different divisions from colliding with each other on the same roads. Radio operators maintained constant communication, reporting progress, identifying bottlenecks, requesting assistance. Maintenance teams followed behind the moving columns, recovering broken-down vehicles, making field repairs, ensuring that the flow of movement continued. This was not chaos. This was not improvisation. This was a machine operating exactly as it had been designed to operate, responding to crisis with systematic efficiency. And most importantly, it was a machine that the Germans had not believed possible. Klaus Hartmann first heard about the American movement on December 21, when his unit received intelligence reports from German reconnaissance aircraft that had managed to penetrate Allied air cover during a brief window of clear weather. The reports described massive American columns moving north through Luxembourg, but the numbers made no sense. The intelligence officers insisted the reports must be wrong, that the pilots had double-counted units or mistaken supply columns for combat troops. An entire American army could not possibly be moving that quickly. The Wehrmacht's own experience suggested it took weeks to prepare such a movement, and even then, it required perfect conditions and complete coordination from the highest levels of command. But the reports kept coming. Radio intercepts revealed American units broadcasting in the clear, coordinating movements without the usual concerns about German signals intelligence. It was as if the Americans did not care that the Germans knew they were coming. As if the sheer speed and scale of their movement made secrecy irrelevant. German commanders began to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Something that fell outside their understanding of how modern armies operated. On December 22, exactly 72 hours after Patton's promise to Eisenhower, the 4th Armored Division launched its attack against the southern shoulder of the German penetration near Arlon, Belgium. Behind them came the 26th Infantry Division, hitting German positions at Wiltz. The 80th Infantry Division struck at Ettelbruck. 3 full divisions. Over 60 men, attacking in coordination after a 100-mile movement through winter weather in 3 days. The German forces in the Ardennes, already overextended and low on supplies, suddenly found themselves fighting on a new front. Hartmann's unit, positioned to the east of Bastogne in what was supposed to be a blocking position against scattered American remnants, found itself facing fresh American armor advancing with obvious confidence and abundant support. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The German soldiers had been told that the Americans were on the verge of collapse, that one more push would break their will to fight. Instead, they were facing an enemy that had somehow conjured an entire army out of the winter night, an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources, unlimited mobility, unlimited resilience. The machinery that made this possible extended far beyond the roads of Belgium and France. It reached back across the Atlantic Ocean to the ports of New York, Boston, Baltimore, and Norfolk. Between June 1944 and December 1944, American ports loaded and shipped over 4 million tons of supplies to Europe every month. This cargo traveled in convoys protected by the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy, crossed the submarine-infested Atlantic, and arrived at ports in Britain and France, where it was unloaded by specialized port battalions, working 24 hours a day. From those ports, supplies moved by rail and truck to depot complexes, where they were sorted, stored, and prepared for forward movement. The entire system operated with industrial precision. Each type of supply had its own handling procedures, its own priority level, its own tracking system. Ammunition was separated by caliber and type, stored in dispersed locations to minimize the risk of catastrophic loss from German bombing. Fuel was transported in 5-gallon jerry cans that could be easily handled by individual soldiers, or in larger tank trucks for bulk transport. Food came in standardized rations. Rations for individual soldiers, C rations for small units, bulk supplies for field kitchens. Medical supplies were packed in standardized kits designed for different types of casualties and different treatment levels. Every item was catalogued, tracked, and allocated according to a system that allowed logistics officers to know exactly what supplies were available, where they were located, and how quickly they could be moved. This system had one symbol that became, for German soldiers who encountered it, the physical embodiment of American abundance and American power. That symbol was the jerry can. Ironically, the jerry can was originally a German invention. In the 1930s, German engineers had designed a fuel container that was superior to anything used by other armies. It held 20 liters, had 3 handles for easy carrying by 1 or 2 men, featured an air pocket that allowed for fuel expansion in hot weather, and had a cam lever cap that could be opened without tools. When the British captured these containers in North Africa, they recognized the design's superiority and began copying it. The Americans, always willing to adopt a good idea regardless of its origin, did the same. By 1944, American factories were producing jerry cans by the millions, and these containers had become the standard method for transporting fuel throughout the Allied armies. For German soldiers, encountering abandoned American positions filled with jerry cans full of fuel was a shocking revelation. The Germans were desperate for fuel, rationing their last drops, immobilizing tanks to conserve what little they had. The Americans seemed to be swimming in it, able to discard full fuel containers as they advanced, confident that more would arrive before they needed it. The jerry can became a symbol of the fundamental inequality of the conflict, one side fighting with abundance, the other fighting with scarcity. Klaus Hartmann experienced this disparity firsthand on December 24, 1940. 4. His Panther tank had been immobilized for 2 days due to fuel shortage. His crew had been surviving on reduced rations, black bread, and ersatz coffee, while waiting for supplies that never came. German supply columns were being harassed by American aircraft, destroyed by American artillery, or simply unable to move forward through the confusion of the battle. That morning, Hartmann and his crew conducted a reconnaissance of an American position that had been overrun by German forces the previous day. What they found there seemed like a scene from a different war, perhaps even a different world. The American position had been a supply point for an armored unit. When the position was abandoned, the Americans had attempted to destroy their supplies to prevent them from falling into German hands. But they had not been thorough. Hartmann's crew found over 50 jerry cans of gasoline, barely damaged. They found crates of rations, not the dried bread and thin soup that constituted German field rations, but canned meat, chocolate bars, coffee, cigarettes. They found ammunition stacked in quantities that represented more than Hartmann's entire company had fired in the past month. They found medical supplies, winter clothing, spare parts for vehicles. The sheer abundance was staggering, and more than that, it was demoralizing. Hartmann realized in that moment that Germany was not fighting an army. Germany was fighting an economy, an industrial system, a society that could produce and transport and distribute resources at a scale that made a mockery of everything German propaganda had said about American weakness. The propaganda had been comprehensive and consistent. Since the early days of the war, German soldiers had been told that America was a nation of gangsters and Jews, a mongrel democracy too corrupt and degenerate to fight a real war. They had been shown films of race riots and labor strikes, told that American society was on the verge of collapse, assured that American soldiers were soft and undisciplined. The propaganda played on German prejudices and fears, painting a picture of America as a land of chaos, where individual greed and ethnic conflict, made organized military action impossible. Some soldiers believed this propaganda completely. Others were skeptical but had no evidence to counter it. But encountering the reality of American military power in the Ardennes destroyed these illusions. The Americans who came to relieve Bastogne were not chaotic or disorganized. They were methodical, professional, and equipped with resources that seemed unlimited. They attacked with coordination and precision, supported by artillery that could deliver devastating firepower within minutes of being requested. When their attacks failed, they simply tried again, apparently unconcerned about the cost in ammunition or equipment. When they succeeded, they advanced carefully, consolidating their gains, bringing up their supplies, and preparing for the next attack. This was not the behavior of a weak or disorganized enemy. This was the behavior of an army that knew it was winning, that had the resources to sustain any level of combat, that could afford to trade material for lives and still have material left over. The contrast between German and American logistics was never more apparent than in the supply of artillery ammunition. Artillery was the dominant killing force on the Western Front, responsible for more casualties than any other weapon system. The ability to deliver sustained, accurate artillery fire could determine the outcome of battles. Both the Americans and the Germans understood this. But only the Americans had the industrial capacity and transportation network to turn understanding into reality. An American artillery battalion in the winter of 1945 could expect to fire thousands of rounds per Dalton Y in sustained combat. Ammunition was delivered regularly, often multiple times, per Dalton Y, by dedicated ammunition trucks that ran on established supply routes. When American infantry requested artillery support, they could expect shells to start falling within minutes, and that fire could continue for hours if necessary. American commanders could use artillery, prodigally, firing preparatory barrages, before attacks, firing harassment and interdiction missions to disrupt enemy movements, firing on suspected enemy positions, just to be sure. The psychological impact of this firepower was profound. German soldiers learned to fear American artillery above all other weapons, to recognize the distinctive sound of American howitzers, to take cover. At the first sign that shells were incoming, German artillery, by contrast, was starved for ammunition. Shells were rationed carefully. Allocated only for the most important missions, German artillery units in the Ardennes offensive began the battle with limited stocks and received only sporadic resupply as the battle progressed. German officers had to make agonizing decisions about when to fire and when to conserve, knowing that ammunition expended now might not be available when it was desperately needed later. This scarcity affected everything. German attacks proceeded with less artillery support, making them more costly and less effective. German defensive positions could not be protected by the same kind of sustained fire that American positions enjoyed. German counter, battery fire. The practice of using artillery to destroy enemy artillery was limited by the simple fact that German guns could not afford to engage in extended duels with American batteries that had effectively unlimited ammunition. The Germans were fighting a poor man's war, conserving resources, making every shot count. The Americans were fighting a rich man's war, using firepower to save lives. Trading shells for soldiers. For Klaus Hartmann and his fellow tankers, watching American artillery pound German positions, while their own guns fell silent. The message was clear: Germany could not win a war of material. The only question was how long it would take for that reality to become undeniable. By December 26, the German offensive in the Ardennes had reached its high-water mark. The 2nd Panzer Division, the deepest German penetration, reached the town of Celles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River. This was the closest any German unit came to achieving the offensive's objective of capturing Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. But at Celles, the 2nd Panzer Division ran out of fuel. Tanks that had rolled for days through snow and battle stopped, simply because there was no more gasoline. The crews could hear American vehicles on the roads around them, could see American aircraft in the clearing skies above them, could watch as American forces moved to surround their position. They were stranded, immobilized not by enemy action, but by the failure of their own logistics system. On December 27, American forces counterattacked at Celles. The 2nd Panzer Division, unable to maneuver, fought from static positions and was systematically destroyed. Over 80 German tanks and assault guns were knocked out or abandoned. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The division that had represented the tip of the German spear was obliterated as a fighting force. Klaus Hartmann was not at Celles, but news of the division's destruction spread quickly through German units. The psychological impact was devastating. The offensive had failed, and it had failed not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because German logistics could not sustain the attack. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, became the symbolic moment that defined the Battle of the Bulge. Bastogne was a critical road junction that the Germans needed to capture to continue their advance. American forces in the town, primarily the 101st Airborne Division, and elements of the 10th Armored Division, had been surrounded since December 20. German commanders demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the American forces, replied with a single word, "Nuts." The response became famous. A moment of defiant humor in the midst of crisis. But what made the defense of Bastogne possible was not humor. It was logistics. The Americans managed to airdrop supplies to the surrounded garrison, delivering ammunition, medical supplies, and food by parachute. When the weather cleared on December 23, over 240 tons of supplies were delivered by air in a single day. The garrison could hold because it was being supplied. When Patton's Third Army broke through German lines and reached Bastogne on December 26, ending the siege, the event was celebrated as a triumph of American mobility and determination. But the real triumph was more fundamental. An entire American army had moved 100 miles in 6 days. Fought its way through German defenses and relieved a surrounded garrison, all while maintaining its supplies, coordination, and combat effectiveness. This was supposed to be impossible. German military planning doctrine said it was impossible. But the Americans had done it anyway, and in doing so, they had demonstrated capabilities that shattered German assumptions about the limitations of modern warfare. The American trucks that made this movement possible were more than just vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the backbone of American military transport, exemplified this philosophy in every aspect of its design. The truck was powered by a 6-cylinder inline engine that produced 104 horsepower, not particularly powerful by modern standards, but extremely reliable and easy to maintain. The engine used a simple carburetor system that could be adjusted by mechanics with minimal training. Parts were standardized, which meant that components from one truck could be used to repair another. The truck's transmission was a 5-speed manual with a 2-speed transfer case that gave it 10 forward gears and 2 reverse gears, allowing it to operate in almost any terrain. The chassis was designed to flex, absorbing punishment from rough roads without breaking. The cargo bed could carry 5.0 pounds on roads, 500 pounds off-road, and was equipped with cargo hoops and canvas covers to protect supplies from weather. Most importantly, the truck could be repaired in the field using basic tools and minimal training. American motor maintenance companies were equipped with mobile workshops that could perform major repairs, but the design philosophy emphasized repairs at the lowest level. If a truck broke down, its driver was expected to be able to diagnose and fix common problems. If the problem was beyond the driver's ability, the truck could be towed to the nearest maintenance point and would be back in service within hours, not days. This reliability and maintainability meant that American logistics officers could plan operations knowing that their trucks would be available when needed. That breakdowns would not cascade into systemic failures, that the flow of supplies would continue regardless of conditions. The German equivalent was the Opel Blitz, a 3-ton truck that was in many ways comparable to the American GMC. But the German logistics system faced challenges that the American system did not. German trucks operated on multiple types of fuel, gasoline, diesel, and even wood gas generators in the later years of the war. This meant that fuel supplies had to be carefully allocated to different units based on what their vehicles could use. German trucks lacked the standardization of the American system, with different models requiring different parts. As the war went on and German industrial capacity was degraded by Allied bombing, spare parts became increasingly scarce. German maintenance companies were well trained and capable, but they could not overcome the fundamental problem of trying to maintain a vehicle fleet with inadequate supplies of parts, tools, and fuel. By the winter of 1945, German logistics had deteriorated to the point where units were cannibalizing broken vehicles for parts, using horses to supplement or replace motor transport, and improvising solutions to problems that should have been solved by proper supply procedures. This was not a failure of individual soldiers or officers. It was a systemic failure born from years of strategic mistakes, industrial inadequacy, and the cumulative damage of Allied interdiction campaigns. Klaus Hartmann saw the consequences of these systemic failures every day. His Panther tank, when it had fuel, was a formidable weapon. The Panther's 75 mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2.0 meters. Its frontal armor was nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. Its optical systems were excellent, its crew well trained, its design sophisticated. But sophistication was a liability when support systems failed. The Panther required specialized maintenance, skilled mechanics, and a steady supply of specific parts. When those things were not available, the tank was just an expensive bunker. Hartmann's experience was not unique. Across the German forces in the Ardennes, tanks were being abandoned, not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they could not be repaired, could not be fueled, could not be moved. German tankers learned to fear not enemy action but mechanical failure, knowing that a broken tank was a dead tank, that there would be no recovery, no repair, no return to combat. This was the reality of fighting a modern war without the industrial capacity to sustain it. The Germans had built an army designed for short, decisive campaigns, for blitzkrieg warfare that would end before logistics became a critical factor. When forced into a long war of attrition against enemies with superior industrial capacity, that army was doomed to slow strangulation, to death by 1,000 inadequacies. The weather in the Ardennes began to clear on December 23, 1944. For the first time since the offensive began, Allied aircraft could take to the skies in large numbers. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. American and British fighter bombers swept over German positions, attacking tanks, trucks, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. American heavy bombers struck German supply routes, rail yards, and communication centers. The interdiction campaign that had been impossible during the fog and snow of the first week of the battle now proceeded with devastating efficiency. German units that had been able to move relatively freely under cover of bad weather now found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to air attack. German supply columns, already struggling with fuel shortages and poor roads, were torn apart by Allied aircraft. The psychological impact of air superiority was as important as the physical damage. German soldiers who had spent years watching the skies for enemy aircraft had developed what one officer called fighter bomber psychosis. A constant fear of air attack that affected decision-making, movement, and morale. The clearing weather meant the return of that omnipresent threat. The knowledge that any movement in daylight might bring destruction from above. The Americans had built the largest air force in the world. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe numbered over 2.0 heavy bombers and 1.0 fighters. The U.S. 9th Air Force, dedicated to tactical support of ground forces, added another 1.5 medium bombers and fighter bombers. These aircraft operated from bases in Britain and France, flew multiple missions per Dalton Y, and were supported by a logistics system that ensured steady supplies of fuel, bombs, ammunition, and spare parts. American pilots were well trained, flying aircraft that were rugged and reliable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter bomber, could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, or 10 rockets, deliver them with reasonable accuracy, and then strafe ground targets with 8.50 caliber machine guns. It could absorb tremendous battle damage and still return to base. It could operate from rough forward airfields, be serviced by ground crews with basic training, and be back in the air within hours. The aircraft was a perfect complement to American ground logistics, rugged, reliable, and effective. German air power, by contrast, had been ground down by years of attrition. The Luftwaffe in late 1944 was a shadow of its former self, starved for fuel, short of pilots, equipped with aircraft that were often superior in performance to Allied planes, but could not be produced or maintained in adequate numbers. German pilots who survived to the Ardennes offensive were experienced and skilled, but they were vastly outnumbered and operating under impossible conditions. When they did manage to take to the air, they faced American pilots, who had the luxury of learning from their mistakes, who could bail out over friendly territory and return to combat. Who flew aircraft that could be replaced within weeks. By January 1, 1945, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was no longer in doubt. German forces, exhausted, out of supplies, and under constant air attack, began to withdraw from their advanced positions. American forces pressed forward, recapturing ground, destroying German units, and inflicting casualties that the Wehrmacht could not afford. The battle would officially end on January 25, 1945, with the Americans regaining all the ground lost in the initial German attack. The cost had been high. American casualties exceeded 80, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement American forces fought in Europe. German casualties were similar in number, but far more devastating in impact. Germany could not replace its losses. The tanks destroyed in the Ardennes, the fuel expended, the ammunition fired. None of it could be adequately replaced. The offensive had accomplished nothing except to accelerate Germany's defeat. Klaus Hartmann survived the battle, but his Panther tank did not. On January 3, 1945, his tank was hit by American artillery while attempting to withdraw from an exposed position. The crew survived, but the tank was destroyed beyond repair. Hartmann and his men walked back through the snow, past abandoned German vehicles, past burning supply dumps, past the wreckage of an offensive that had promised to change the course of the war and had instead merely confirmed what was already inevitable. What Hartmann remembered most vividly from those weeks was not the combat, not the fear, not even the cold. What he remembered was the sound of American trucks on the roads at night, a sound that never seemed to stop, never seemed to diminish. A mechanical thunder that represented something more fundamental than military power. It represented a system, a society, an industrial democracy that could sustain warfare at a scale that Germany simply could not match. The German soldiers had been taught to believe in the superiority of German discipline, German organization. They had believed that victory would come from superior training, superior tactics, superior fighting spirit. What they learned in the Ardennes was that none of those things mattered when the enemy could move an army in a night, could replace losses faster than you could inflict them, could fight not with desperation but with abundance. The Americans did not win the Battle of the Bulge through superior tactics or brilliant strategy. They won it through logistics, through industrial capacity, through the systematic application of resources to the problem of war. They won it because they could afford to lose a battle and still win the war, because they could absorb punishment and still come back stronger. Because they represented a form of power that was not based on heroic individuals or mystical racial superiority, but on the prosaic, unglamorous work of building trucks, paving roads, training drivers, coordinating schedules, and ensuring that the bullets reached the rifles and the fuel reached the tanks. The jerrycan became, for Hartmann and thousands of German soldiers like him, a symbol of this fundamental disparity. In the weeks after the battle, as German units retreated toward the Rhine River, they passed through areas that had been occupied by American forces. Number script completion. Final 1,000 words. Everywhere they looked, they saw discarded jerry cans, abandoned supply crates. Equipment left behind, not because it was destroyed, but because it was no longer needed, because more was already on the way. The Americans fought like men who knew that whatever they expended today would be replaced tomorrow. The Germans fought like men who knew that every round fired, every liter of fuel consumed, every spare part used, might be the last one available. This was not a difference in courage or determination. This was a difference in systems. In economies, in the fundamental capacity to sustain modern industrial warfare. The lessons of the Ardennes offensive reverberated far beyond that winter battlefield. For American military planners, the operation validated everything they had built over the previous 3 years. The logistics system worked. The emphasis on standardization, on reliability over sophistication, on flexibility over rigid planning. All of it had been proven correct under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The ability to move Patton's Third Army 100 miles in 72 hours became a case study that would be taught in military academies for generations. It demonstrated that modern warfare was not just about combat power, but about the systems that sustained combat power, that victory went not necessarily to the side with the best soldiers or the best weapons, but to the side that could keep its soldiers supplied and its weapons functioning. For the Germans, the lessons were bitter, but undeniable. The final illusions about Germany's ability to turn the tide of the war died in the snows of the Ardennes. The realization spread through the Wehrmacht like a winter chill. They were not fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting factories. Every American division destroyed would be replaced by 2 more. Every American tank knocked out would be replaced by 5 more. Every American position captured would be retaken by men who arrived with more ammunition than the Germans had seen in months. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable, and no amount of tactical brilliance, operational daring, or individual heroism could overcome the fundamental disparity in resources. Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes was based on a profound misunderstanding of his enemy. He believed that democracies were inherently weak, that multinational coalitions could not coordinate effectively, that American soldiers lacked the will to fight. He believed that a single decisive blow could shatter Allied unity and force a negotiated peace. What he failed to understand was that American power was not based on the things he valued: racial purity, authoritarian efficiency, mystical nationalism. American power was based on something far more prosaic and far more formidable: the ability to organize, to produce, to transport, to sustain. The American military was not a warrior cult or a political movement. It was a machine, built from the combined efforts of millions of workers, engineers, logistics officers, truck drivers, and common soldiers, all working within a system designed to translate industrial capacity into military power. The infrastructure that made this possible extended back through every level of American society. The factories in Detroit that produced the trucks were staffed by workers who had been building automobiles for decades, who understood mass production and quality control. The ports that shipped supplies overseas were operated by longshoremen who worked with industrial efficiency, loading and unloading cargo with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else in the American war effort. The training camps that prepared soldiers for combat also prepared them to maintain equipment, to drive trucks, to operate radios, to perform the 1,000 small tasks that kept a modern army functioning. The entire society had been mobilized, not through coercion or ideology, but through a combination of patriotic motivation and economic incentive. American workers were paid well, fed well, and given every reason to believe that their work mattered. The result was a war economy that operated at a scale and efficiency that had never been seen before in human history. The contrast with Germany was total. The German war economy, despite its reputation for efficiency, was hobbled by ideological rigidity, political infighting, and the unwillingness to fully mobilize until it was too late. German women were not brought into the workforce in significant numbers until late in the war, despite the desperate need for workers. German industry was never fully rationalized, with different companies producing competing designs of similar equipment, wasting resources on duplication and preventing the standardization that made American logistics so effective. German strategic planning was driven by Hitler's intuition and ideology, rather than by systematic analysis of resources and capabilities. The result was an economy that could produce sophisticated weapons, but could not produce them in adequate quantities, could not supply them properly, and could not sustain the forces that used them. Klaus Hartmann would spend the remaining months of the war retreating eastward, watching the disintegration of the Wehrmacht, witnessing the end of everything he had been told to believe in. He would survive to see the final surrender in May 1945, would spend years as a prisoner of war, would eventually return to a Germany that no longer existed. But the memory that stayed with him, that defined his understanding of the war, was that sound of American trucks in the winter darkness, rolling north through the Ardennes with their headlights blazing, carrying an entire army to battle in a single night. It was the sound of inevitability, of a power so vast and so systematic that resistance was ultimately futile. It was the sound of modern industrial warfare being waged by a nation that had mastered not just the art of combat but the science of logistics. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive in the West, the final throw of the dice, by a regime that had already lost everything. But more than that, it was a demonstration of what total war meant in the industrial age. It meant that courage and skill and tactical brilliance, while important, were ultimately secondary to the capacity to produce, to transport, to supply. It meant that the side which could keep its army fed, fueled, and equipped would eventually triumph over the side that could not, regardless of any other factors. The Americans moved an army in a night not through magic or through the genius of individual commanders, but through the systematic application of industrial and organizational principles to the problem of warfare. They won because they had built a machine capable of winning, and they had the resources to keep that machine running no matter how long the war lasted. For the German tankers who witnessed this power firsthand, who saw their own forces wither from supply starvation while American forces seemed to grow stronger every day, the lesson was clear and final: you cannot fight a modern war without modern logistics, and you cannot sustain modern logistics without modern industry. Germany had lost the war not on the battlefield but in the factories, on the supply routes, in the fundamental economic imbalance between the two sides. The Battle of the Bulge simply made that reality impossible to deny any longer.